Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. It's the first episode of 2025, and unlike the start of other years, this one could be monumental for vaping, potentially shaping its future for millions of Americans. The stakes couldn't be higher as the industry waits for Donald J. Trump to be sworn in as the 47th President of the United States. During the election campaign, Trump stated on Truth Social, "I saved flavored vaping in 2019, and it greatly helped people get off smoking." He added, "I'll save vaping again." The question is, will he? As always, the answer could lie in the details. Joining us today to discuss what needs to be done to save vaping in the U.S. is Clive Bates, a renowned tobacco control policy expert and former Director of Action on Smoking and Health UK. Clive, it's great for you coming back on the show. Thank you.
Hello, Brent. It's great to be back. There is so much to discuss. Let's get to it.
So we haven't talked since Trump won his second term in office. What was your first reaction?
Well, I have to confess, I'm not a MAGA kind of guy. And from the European end of the European side of the Atlantic, it's all very destabilizing as we have the potential venue for World War III to the east of us, and none of this looks good from our point of view. However, the American people, or as some would say, maybe a few American billionaires, have made their choice. President Trump is the president-elect, and we can't change any of that. Everybody has to think, well, what do we do? What could be got out of this? Where are the influences? Where are the levers? What does he like? What doesn't he like? What are his people's obsessions and all of that? And piecing all of that together to come up with something that works in a compelling way for them and the way they see the world is the way to go, because we don't choose presidents.
So what are your thoughts then on what a victory, Trump's victory, could mean for vaping?
To be honest, Brent, you might as well spin a bottle in terms of making predictions here. We really don't know, and there's precious few statements to go on from the people he has nominated to be Health and Human Services and nominated to be FDA. So there's very, very little to kind of get your teeth into. We know, as you said, that Trump himself sees himself as a harm reductionist, say vaping, and stop to help a lot of people quitting. That's a huge start. The fact that he basically understands the concept that one product can be safer than another, and could potentially, reduce the risk to people if people go from high risk to low risk, and that he sees it as a win for himself, something that he achieved in his first term. That's a pretty good starting point. Then you've got, the sort of incoming Elon Musk, Vivek sort of axis that want to take a flamethrower to the federal government, and the question then is, and I think one that works in favor of harm reduction, is looking for places where there is unnecessary bureaucracy. And I'm a former civil servant myself, so I'm the first to say that there is necessary bureaucracy. People don't want to live in an unregulated, free-for-all kind of dog-eat-dog kind of world. But at the same time, they don't want the state bearing down on them, closing legitimate businesses, stopping people doing good things for themselves and so on. So in there somewhere, there's the potential for a rethink about the entire way FDA is approaching these issues. So again, I think that's quite encouraging. There's no way on earth that Musk and Elon Musk and Vivek will take $2 trillion out of the federal budget, but they've got to take something out, and they certainly can't go increasing it with extra funding. Now, FDA's Center for Tobacco Products is a slightly different position. It's not funded by the taxpayer; it's funded by tobacco user fees. So $712 million a year is collected from the tobacco companies and is used to fund the Center for Tobacco Products, and FDA would like another $114 million a year on top of that. So there's no tax savings to be had there, but there are definitely efficiencies. And the money in the end comes out of the pockets like a tax. The money comes out of the pockets of people who smoke. People who smoke tend to be poorer, so it's a particularly regressive form of implicit taxation. So there's every reason to try and control that expenditure, because if you're a smoker, it might as well be taxed. So there, I think there's some good basic things that could be got right. Trump as a harm reductionist, an assault on wasteful bureaucracy in the federal government. And FDA's Center for Tobacco Products is the absolute pinnacle of wasteful bureaucracy. We're sure we'll come back to that. And then a desire to do something for the base of people that all pay for this, and that will tend to be, in the case of Center for Tobacco Products, that will tend to be poorer people, ordinary working people, people who are out of the labor market or whatever, who I suspect are disproportionately represented in Trump's MAGA base.
Just looking at Trump's list of nominees, there's no doubt that the potential is incredible, but I should note that some on the list may not make it through Senate confirmation. So there could be changes to the list of nominees before this episode airs, as it's being recorded prior to the new year. And also the Republicans take control of the Senate on January 3rd, so it's likely confirmation hearings may have already started in preparation for Trump to be sworn in on the 20th. Clive, the agency with the most direct impact, which you've mentioned, is the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Just following the election, you wrote an article titled "Bringing the Flamethrower to Reform to FDA Center for Tobacco Products." So just to be clear, because you've already mentioned it, are you calling for Trump to burn down the FDA?
No, it's a metaphor, and I think federal regulation is a good thing to do, and we would soon find out. Without federal regulation, we'd see a patchwork of state level municipal regulation that would be far worse. It would be far more arbitrary, be far more difficult to stay on top of. Now, there's no doubt in my mind a rational, proportionate, pro-health, pro-harm reduction regulatory framework at the federal level is the right way to go. So whilst I'm advocating the use of a flamethrower, I don't really mean burn the whole thing down. I mean burn off the waste. And there's a lot of waste. I mean, a typical pre-market tobacco application will take a successful one, $20 million to $80 million to get through. Now, there's almost no products that have if you like, the revenue, for the flow of revenue that can support that as a compliance cost. So it's a massive filter for size. The only things that can get through are massive companies with massive balance sheets and the ability to cross-subsidize from one activity to another. And the best profile for that is a tobacco company. And they happen to be the ones that have been successful so far. But if you look at what was originally expected, FDA, when it did its regulatory impact analysis, said that the cost of a PMTA would, first of a kind, be typically under $500,000, not 20 million to 80 million, and that subsequent ones would be under $200,000. They said it would take 180 days. That's actually written into the law, and it's now taking multiple years. Some of the pouch products have just been sitting there for 4 years waiting for something to happen. So what I would like to see is FDA to reconceptualize their process for approving these products, so it gets back to something closer to what was intended. Under $500,000, done in 180 days, and sufficiently low burden that several thousand, not several tens of products can get through. And what I think would be good would be to see parity with cigarettes. So FDA produces this very helpful database. It tells you how many cigarette products there are on the market, and the answer is 3,816. Okay. If you take all combustible products, it's 14,444. Okay. If you look at vapes, it's 34 products, which are really 8 systems that are all basically the same. Tobacco or menthol, tobacco industry, kind of convenience, high volume products. Okay. Now, what if we had a regulatory system that allowed through a roughly similar number of vapes as cigarettes? So let's say, 3,800 or 4,000 or something like that. It can't be unreasonable to have 4,000 different vapes on the market if there's 4,000 different cigarettes on the market. I don't know what the argument against that would be. So imagine going back into FDA and saying, come back with a regulatory scheme that is capable of passing 4,000 products, that costs under $500,000 per product application and roughly in line with what you said it would in the regulatory impact assessment, and a process that takes 180 days or less, like it says in the law. Okay. Then we can talk about a sensible, proportionate regulatory system. And that will cost FDA a lot less, because if you have to assess it in 180 days, you can't be spending too much time doing it. It will cost the vendors much less, and it will ultimately cost the consumers much less. It will give far greater diversity, but it will give some assurance that there's enough products on the market to meet the demand. So the one other thing that's insane about the system that they have at the moment, which they are incredibly proud of, and I've heard Brian King and the chief scientist and all that telling us how great this is. But the problem is, Brent, it only applies to around 6% of the products sold in the United States. Everything else is just going round. It's just going, yeah, whatever. We're not bothered about the FDA. We're just going to put the products on the market. Or they're products that are locked in legal conflict with the FDA, or they're products that have been under review for years and are still under review. So only 6% of the market at the moment is actually authorized to FDA standard. So its entire regulatory edifice is basically pointless at the level of the whole market. So it needs to get a grip on the market as a whole. It needs to get back to having around 4,000 products on. And that isn't an incremental change. That's not like going from 34 vapes to 65. It's like going from 34 to 4,000 requires a rethink in the mindset. And coming back to where we started from, that's why I think the Department of Government Efficiency, Elon Musk, Vivek and everything, that they would be the kind of people to apply that kind of pressure for a total rethink, not just incremental changes that the kind of, the tobacco companies basically just want a few tweaks to make it a bit cheaper. But what it actually needs is a major overhaul.
Do you think that Vivek or Elon have an understanding about the importance of vaping?
I would be really surprised if they know anything about it. And if they do know anything about it, it will be in an instinct play based on what they've seen in the newspapers or what they've experienced with personal friends or contacts or kids around them. So one doesn't really know. I mean, RFK Jr. is, skeptical about businesses and the commercial determinants of health. So that's not necessarily a good thing. But it might be possible to frame something that makes sense for them. I just don't know. And I just don't think anybody's focused on this yet. But I think the thing on our side is that we need to come at them with a set of proposals that will deliver a non-incremental change. I mean, the tobacco companies are generally pushing incremental changes because that suits them. It gives them oligopoly power. It shuts out all the little guys, all the creative people from China, whatever. What's needed is a complete rethink that changes that market from a few dozen to a few thousand products authorized.
So about the authorization, you've brought this up many times on our show before, and one of the only people to do that is say that to say that the FDA's authorization scheme in and of itself is completely the wrong approach. Whereas, say, in other countries like Canada, for instance, there is no authorization scheme. Products come on the market, they meet certain standards for, safety and so forth, but there's no authorization. So could the U.S. actually throw out this authorization scheme?
No, I don't think they can, not under the current law. So I conceptualize this as reform in two steps, okay? So what can be done under the letter of the existing Tobacco Control Act, okay? Which is essentially requires a pre-market authorization process and requires FDA to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the secretary appropriate for the protection of public health. Okay. And I think there's a totally different way of going about that that's much more efficient. Then I think there's a second level of regulation that requires you to change the Tobacco Control Act. And in this model of regulation, you're much closer to saying, well, how do we regulate this like it's a popular recreational drug, which is basically what it is. Okay. So in that framework, you're borrowing ideas from, say, the regulation of beer or wine. So you have product safety standards, you have labeling standards, you have to prove the content of the drug. You have microbiological standards. You don't want pathogens swimming around in your beer. You have a set of commercial regulations as well about where it can be sold, how it can be marketed, and so on. So that framework, to me, the thing that we already use in the United States for alcoholic beverages, is a much closer fit to the regulatory problem that you're actually trying to solve in that marketplace, particularly once we get to a position where cigarette use has gone right down, as it already is doing in the younger age groups, when you've got people just taking it up because they've always taken up nicotine. And appropriate for the protection of public health kind of starts to break down when you don't have a starting point of cigarettes, because nobody asks, is beer appropriate for the protection of public health, or is this glass of wine appropriate? They say, well, people like it and want it. Is the level of risk that it imposes tolerable? So you have a tolerability of risk, acceptability of risk framework, which is based on standards. So that's where I think you would go in the longer term, but that requires Congress to open up the Tobacco Control Act. More interesting to me is what you would do in the short term. And I think there's sort of three basic things, okay? So instead of trying to second guess the impact of a product that goes into the market, which is ultimately dependent on what all the other products do and all the other pricing does and everything else, not something you can know in advance. You only assess the things in advance that you can know in advance. So things like the toxicology, the marketing plan, the electrical and thermal safety standards of the product, and as far as possible, you codify all of that into guidance. So it's not exactly a standard, but you say, look, if you meet these thresholds here, then it's fine. You're appropriate for the protection of public health and you're fit to go on the market. If you don't meet them, then you have to do more work to demonstrate why it's appropriate for the protection of public health. So it's not a standard. It's like a guideline for the way through the process easily. The second thing you then do is, instead of having each company who's got through this process do its own individual market surveillance, you basically have the FDA or some agency surveil the whole market, including all the approved or authorized products, including all the unauthorized products, and including all the illicit products. So you have a strong, clear picture of what's actually going on in the marketplace. And on the basis of that, you then take retrospective corrective action on the products that you've approved. If those are going wrong in some way, if you find that they're appearing in nurseries, or that they've become really popular on kids' TV or something, then fine, you do something about it. If they're not authorized products, you use it to guide your enforcement activity so that you're not enforcing against ridiculously minor marginal products. You're actually tackling the main product, the main problem. And so all the stuff that you're trying to second guess through pre-market assessment, like, how many people will use this product and how many will quit smoking and everything, all of things you can't possibly know in advance. And the only reason we know anything at the moment is a lot of these products been on the market for many years, but in future they won't have been. So you can't know those things, so stop pretending you can. Do that after the fact. Now, if you divide the process into those two phases, a sort of screening process before, mass surveillance in the middle, and then post-market correction or enforcement after, the whole cost would come down absolutely enormously.
One of the things that I'm often struggling with when looking at FDA's authorization process is the difference between devices and the pod juice that goes with that device, or other products that might just be companies who are producing e-liquid. They almost seem to not really be considered properly inside this framework because they're not making a device, they're, that kind of thing. So you've got this separation between open and closed systems, and FDA just has not incorporated that separation properly.
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, the way FDA approaches this now is that it basically forces you to have a particular kind of product because it's impossible to get through its evaluation process without that. But if you had a standards-based approach for liquids and a standards-based approach for devices, and possibly a standards-based approach for combinations of the two, then you could say, well, this device with this liquid will be all right. And if something goes wrong, after the fact, if you find something's not working or some corrosion or something, then you take corrective action. But trying to do all that up front, it's just not possible. It's why we end up with the unfortunate companies running through these $20 to $80 million hoops to try to get their products onto the market. When, by the way, the Chinese manufacturers are just going, yeah, I don't think we're going to spend $20 to $80 million. That's for American businesses who are law abiding. We are just going to sell straight into the market because we are spending our creative resources not on trying to justify products that are now 10 years old. We are producing the products that customers want today. And those are the big puff disposable devices that have become really, really popular. Nothing wrong with the products that the Chinese are producing, by the way, for the most part, very good products. But they're just not going through this regulatory pathway, or they would never see the light of day. They'd be stuck in some 5-10 year queue. Okay, so they're not doing that. There's a model of commerce that brings the products in from China by the container load. They're sold through small intermediaries. You can't pin down some giant company like Altria or Reynolds or Joule or whatever and hold them to account for it. It's an incredibly fluid marketplace in which the products flow like water around rocks. So you can put those rocks in the way, but the water's just going to flow around them. And that's what they're dealing with out there. And that's why 94% of the market is served by products that haven't been approved by the FDA. And that's why everything FDA is doing is basically a waste of time. So it's not actually a choice for them to change in the way that I say if they want to get a grip on the market. The only way they can get a grip on the market is to crowd out that illicit trade by having far better pathways to markets for around 4,000 products, not 34, not 64, not 104, but 4,000. And that's what will change the marketplace completely. Just as it is to some extent in Europe, it's a little bit like that. I mean, there are 300,000 products in the European gateway system. So you've got a completely different approach in Europe. And you're not seeing people dropping dead, walking down the streets, falling apart. To the extent there was ever a fatal outbreak of vape-related illness, it was the EVALI cases, which were illegal black market THC products with vitamin E acetate added. So that's where the risk comes from. Black markets, not regulated markets.
Let's talk about Trump's nominees, as they are the ones who would be making the changes. For FDA Commissioner, Trump has nominated Dr. Marin Makary, who was a Johns Hopkins University surgeon and researcher. He rose to prominence more than a decade ago as a critic of the medical establishment. He was largely opposed to vaccine mandates during the COVID pandemic. For CDC Director, Trump has nominated Dr. Dave Weldon, who is a former Florida congressman and a physician. Trump said, quote, "Americans have lost trust in the CDC and in our federal health authorities, who have engaged in censorship, data manipulation, and misinformation. The CDC must step up and correct past errors to focus on the prevention of disease." Clive, could a change in leadership then at the FDA and CDC make a big difference to what you're saying?
It could. I mean, those are valid. There's lots of valid criticisms of CDC, and FDA. Of course, I've just listed like a load of problems with FDA right now. It's basically in this space it's in. It's absolutely useless. It's just protecting the cigarette trade, turning the market illicit, and has lost complete control. So that's no use as a regulation. Pay anything for that, let alone pay more for it. CDC, we know, has kind of led a misinformation war on this. It's that subtle kind of misinformation where you don't always say things that are false, but you just say things that are true but misleading. So a lot of the things like EVALI and gateway effects and the presentation of youth data, you have never, ever heard anyone from CDC or FDA say, well, that young person who's vaping, well, in a world without vapes, that person would have been a smoker, would have been an adolescent smoker. They have never embraced that thought. And Brian King, does one if you even ask him to think about that. So they are rejecting the underlying public health rationale here for harm reduction as it applies to young people, which is that they're diverted away from smoking. So the charge sheet for both FDA and CDC is very long. The question is whether when you raise those criticisms of CDC, as voiced by the nominees or FDA for that matter, is that what they're talking about? Or are they off on some mad thing about vaccines? Because, and no one's going to convince me. I mean, the data is unbelievably strong on vaccines. You can see these really horrible childhood diseases stopped in their tracks by the measles vaccine, chickenpox vaccine, and so on. So we get into a situation where we're going backwards to getting these sort of, the sort of Victorian era diseases of slums and overcrowding, is not a great step forward. So it really depends for me whether this is just anti-vaxxer kind of man. I know there are people who are anti-vax who probably view your show, Brent, but I'm not going to go down that route. Vaccines have been unbelievably positive for kids and for society as a whole. Whatever you might think about the COVID, put an end to the COVID outbreak as well. So I'm not going to entertain vaccine skepticism in this. But if that's the focus of the people that Trump has brought in, then that's a bad thing. If it's saying we genuinely want to restore trust to CDC, we don't want it to pursue the sort of ideological ends of well-off Democrats, which is one way of looking at anti-vaping. You've got the sort of Chuck Schumer sort of brigade and the moms against what are they called, parents against vaping, yeah. From some kind of fancy neighborhood in New York, who are all very, very up in arms about this and raising money for it. And Michael Bloomberg, who's not exactly working class, if they say, well, yeah, you people, you've got your ideas, but you're totally out of touch with the ordinary American, Janet or Joe, who is kind of struggling to get through life, likes a little toke at their nicotine, and that's their little thing, that's their moment of peace and calm. And what you're doing is basically bullying them with falsehoods and fabrications. Okay. And if they come up with that, that's very good. If they say, stop focusing on middle class kids who, if they ever vape, will quit by the time they're 22 when they go to a nice university or get a nice fancy job in an investment bank, they're never going to be the problem. The kids that are the problem are the ones, that are out of school, they're carrying knives, they're taking drugs, they're fighting, joining gangs. Those are the kids you should be focused on, and those are the kids who, in the alternative world, would be smoking. So getting back to some of that more real grounded public health, that would be really welcome.
Yeah, instead of social engineering, deal with reality, help make it better, but don't try to change people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the public health should be about helping people help themselves. It's like an enabling thing, both for the individual and for the context in which the individual operates. But too often it's become a bullying thing. So it's the favorite tools of tobacco control are punitive, taxation, coercive, restrictions on where you can smoke and, restrictions on what you can smoke and what you can vape and so on. And then stigmatizing, which is all the warning labels and the anti-smoking campaigns and the exclusions and everything. Now, okay, some of that's justified probably, but it is quite an oppressive agenda. If you're already a bit poor, a bit downtrodden, your home isn't secure, or you're homeless, or you haven't got healthcare coverage, or all of these things crowd in on people, and the nicotine use is a little bit of light relief from the awfulness of that. I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying that if you want to explain it, it comes from, you want an explanation rather than a justification. It comes from the fact that using nicotine makes people feel better and feel as though they function better.
Clive, tobacco control is really just people control, isn't it?
What it's trying to do is achieve behavior change from people, okay? And there's a range of ways of doing that, but it tends to prefer the things that are more coercive. So rules, regulation, taxes, stigma, and so on. I prefer the things that are more consensual, so that you make changes in the way people behave because they want to, and you encourage them to, and you help them. So, for example, switching from smoking to vaping is a really good thing to do, or switching from smoking to pouches, or even vaping to pouches. All of these things are good things to do. And there's a way of doing that that is by consensus or respecting the autonomy of the user. So, for example, giving them realistic risk information instead of lying about it, giving them information on the packs, making it easy to buy these things, making it clear that they can be made reasonably safe if they are regulated to an appropriate standard and therefore much safer than smoking, making them have confidence in a range of brands that are, if we were all just buying moonshine instead of beer and wine, I don't think we'd be happy about it. We'd be like getting that thing that happened in Laos, where, people are suddenly drinking methyl alcohol, going blind and dying. So good regulation and good supportive consumer protection regulation helps build confidence in things. And that's why you want it. You don't want a total free-for-all.
Clive, I'm curious about what you think about Trump's nomination of Jay Bhattacharya for director of the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Bhattacharya is a Stanford physician and economist who co-authored an anti-lockdown treatise during the coronavirus pandemic known as the Great Barrington Declaration. Dr. Bhattacharya would oversee the world's premier medical research agency with a $48 billion budget and 27 separate institutes and centers under his purview.
From a policy point of view, I think it's good to have people with an economic mindset in charge. I mean, the best research on policy, policy is essentially an economic discipline. You intervene in a marketplace, then the various actors reconfigure their interests, reconfigure their behavior and in their own interests. So that's a sort of all economic behaviors. And so some of the best work we've seen in the tobacco control field has been looking at the effect of flavor bans, for example, through the lens of economics, or the effect of taxes through the lens of economics. So I think that's a good thing. So I don't think anybody should be worried about having an economist in charge, because the economist's way of thinking is a good way of thinking in this space. The Great Barrington Declaration, wasn't a fan, but in fairness, I do think it's legitimate to be skeptical about the effects of lockdowns. It's not my specialist subject, but it's had some terrible effects on young people. School closures have been devastating. There's a sort of long tail of mental health problems following behind that. We had an interesting natural experiment with the effects in Sweden, which need to be properly, where there wasn't really a lockdown culture. There was strong warnings, and then people made their own decisions about whether they wanted to isolate themselves or not. So I don't think the lockdown discussion is, for example, as cut and dried as the vaccine discussion in the COVID area. And I think we undervalued some of the negative consequences of lockdowns in general, particularly with younger people who weren't that much at risk. I mean, most of the mortality and the disease vulnerability was concentrated in older people, but younger people bore the brunt of lockdowns. So there's a legitimate question. There's a legitimate scientific and economic question there, which is, I think, probably still to be evaluated fully and completely across the whole world. So I'm a bit less concerned about him than the sort of anti-vaxxers, and I would actually welcome a proper sort of economic mindset in an NIH we could do with seeing a lot fewer of these papers where somebody does a spurious correlation and then writes down a policy recommendation. Oh, look, it turns out that people who vape have more backache, therefore we need to ban flavored vapes or something. I mean, the level of pitiful reasoning that you see in these papers is absolutely dire. One final problem with NIH is that it starts its research agenda with a defined outcome, which is the end of tobacco and nicotine, effectively wants to put an end to tobacco use. Well, if you start with that, where's the space for harm reduction? Where is the space for thinking that this might be something like alcohol? In other words, it's a popular recreational drug that people will continue to use for the foreseeable future, because that to me is a much more realistic way of thinking about nicotine than thinking it's something that's just about to disappear, given that it's been in use for about 12,000 years so far. I don't think starting with a final conclusion is a scientifically respectable way of approaching a research program. You should investigate a phenomenon with a view to finding out how to manage it and control the risks and so on. You shouldn't start from the premise that you're trying to obliterate it and then work back through the research program that you need to justify that.
Clive, we hear from researchers all the time that the NIH will not fund studies looking to demonstrate the efficacy of vaping for smoking cessation. So to your point, they've already made up their mind. They're not funding any research that, could prove the point. Wouldn't that be like a major change, even just to unlock NIH funding for solid research on harm reduction and smoking cessation using vape?
Well, Brent, you probably know that I look at all the new papers that have been added to PubMed in this space every week, and there's typically somewhere between 30 and 70. And I have to tell you, you can spot the American ones from space, because they're all pointing in a certain direction. They're all creating reasons to close down, to regulate more, to spend more, to do more surveillance, to have more heavy-handed measures, even though the products are much less harmful than the dominant product in the market. Now, if you look at the British equivalent, which is much less because there's far less money involved. There's far fewer papers. But what they look like is quite different. They adopt a problem-solving approach. So they're asking questions like, how do we get people to stop smoking when they come and visit a hospital? Or what do we do about people who are smoking in prisons? Or let's have a think about what's happening with homeless people where there are extremely high levels of smoking. Or what's the right approach to smoking in pregnancy? We know we don't like smoking in pregnancy. We don't like vaping either. But what if we could get people who smoke to switch to vaping? Would that be a win or a loss or what? So the research question, I mean, I would say the first stage of science is actually asking a question. And the problem in the United States is that the wrong questions are asked and the right questions are not asked. Whereas I think in Britain, we're a bit better at asking the right, interesting questions for making progress in public health. And that's different to what FDA wants to do. Because the challenge of, FDA and NIH kind of in league in this. What they want to do is give us reasons for regulating tobacco, in which they include vapes and so on. In Britain, what we're saying is give us a way we can reduce the burden of harm and health impacts, which is a much more open-minded thing because it doesn't exclude doing it with, vapes or pouches or other alternative nicotine products.
Now, Clive, I've saved the big addition, I think, to last, and that's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Trump has nominated him for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Secretary. The HHS oversees the FDA, the CDC. I mean, really, they're the top of the food chain when it comes to it in the U.S. What could it mean for vaping in the U.S. with RFK Jr. as HHS Secretary?
Well, look, again, it's a spin of the bottle as far as I'm concerned. I'm afraid, Brent, I don't know these people well enough. I don't know that anybody does to know where they'll come down on this. But if he wants to do a few things, if he wants to actually save some lives, if he wants to have a fight with the tobacco industry, if he wants to reduce the costs of bureaucracy, if he wants to support American businesses, if he wants to, put a barrier in the way of Chinese businesses running riot illegally, if there's a bunch of things there that if he wants to do them, he can do them, and he can get political cover for doing them in Congress because, as you know, both houses of both branches of Congress have gone to the same party, supportive court, probably. Don't know that yet. So, we're in a position where there's a kind of good alignment of things that could go right for a politician who wants to, with the backing of the president, wants to make harm reduction work, wants to make vaping work. Okay. And he then can provide the political cover for a suitable appointment in FDA and even in the Center for Tobacco Products to make the changes that are necessary, not by changing the law, but by changing the way FDA and Center for Tobacco Products interprets the law into something that actually works rather than something that's an embarrassing failure. And it's not that hard to do it because it involves spending less money. It involves having fewer people working less insane hours. It would be more interesting for most of the people at FDA to do that because the scientists then wouldn't be sitting there looking at, near identical 400,000 page applications. They would be actually focusing on novel products, novel technologies, novel risks. They could then actually use their scientific training to do something useful. So right down the line, starting from politics in Congress, right down to the, humble assessor buried in paperwork in FDA, there's a win-win-win-win-win all the way down the line. So it just needs, the HHS secretary, whoever that is in the end, if he gets it or not, to seize that opportunity, set out the political mandate for doing it, and then get somebody who's capable of doing it as both the FDA commissioner and the Center for Tobacco Products.
One of my concerns, Clive, is that people won't take this seriously, meaning, of course, the new FDA commissioner, the new CDC director, even Jay Bhattacharya at NIH, how much is he going to be thinking about vaping as an issue? It's a good thing that they may want to clean up some of the misperceptions around science and some corruption in scientific research, but are they going to necessarily look at vaping, or are they just going to defer to, like you said, the parents against vaping?
All right, well, it depends. I mean, that is where the Democrats have gone wrong, and the Democrats should learn some serious lessons from this. The Democrats have gone with the New York elite establishment view of how America should work, and they've had a rebuff to that from the electorate. Not a massive rebuff, but a rebuff it is, and they are now licking their wounds, wondering where they went wrong. Well, the interesting thing, I think, here is that, to some people it seems like a trivial issue, except that there's 20 million vapers, okay? There's 30 million smokers, okay? And there's probably about, 5 million who overlap. Now, that's a lot of Americans, in terms of the kind of problems that you're trying to deal with, that's a lot of people affected by those decisions. And, I'm not going to call it populism because it's actually good politics to do what people want. But thinking about the interests of those people, walking in their shoes for a bit, and the fact that it's easy and cheap and, cost saving and time saving, bureaucratically plausible, doesn't need new regulation to get a win for 20 million Americans, to get a win for 30 million American smokers. What's not to like? So again, to me, it's about framing a political proposition here that grabs the attention, because while they're doing, first of all, while they're distracted on crazy things, I don't know, they're bound to do crazy things. Those will be a distraction, and they will just kind of run themselves into the ground on that stuff. Once they get to deal with the reality of it, people will stop them. There'll be all kinds of barriers. Here, you've got, or they'll do things that are crazy and wrong, and that will just set them back when they get hit by the unintended consequences. Here, they have a prospect of an actual win that's relatively easy to deliver, is aligned with the president's previous statements, is technically good for public health. I mean, I'm not like I'm suggesting that, everybody should just be thrown in front of a tobacco industry juggernaut. Far from it. This is the thing that gets them away from that. And there's 45 million Americans potentially grateful to you for sorting it out, what is actually an important thing in their lives. So this is all about people who are advocates in this field, whether it's professional lobbyists or consumer activists or individuals or vape shops or whatever, seeing the opportunity here, whatever they feel about Trump and MAGA and all that, got to put all that to one side and think, what's the value proposition you want to put to these people, looking at where they're coming from. That's how you do politics. You don't say, well, I'm so appalled by these people, I can't speak to them. You framing now something in their world that makes sense for them. And there's definitely a proposition for them in fixing vaping, fixing the FDA, fixing the Center for Tobacco Products, and rethinking the pre-market tobacco application process completely from the bottom up.